All right, thank you, Zenon. And a very warm welcome to you all for this closing session on the regulation stage. I'm Jas, and as a member of the newly launched GFTN, or previously known as Elivandi, it's a privilege to be hosting you all at this year's Singapore FinTech Festival. Now, turning our attention to this session, I have the pleasure of hosting two gentlemen on this topic of navigating geopolitics. We have Alex here, a former partner at KPMG, an academic and an author, and of course Ziad, a consultant at McKinsey and previously at various US departments. I'll ask them to very quickly introduce themselves and how they've been involved with the topic on the session. Alex, you first.
Okay, so the term techno-nationalism, which is the title of my book, is something I've been thinking about for actually decades. And it really comes down to how nation states use technology, how they harness technology to further their national security objectives, to build their economic strength, and increasingly how nation states use technology to enforce stability or to try and achieve stability in society. So with that, as time went on, I began thinking more and more about it, and I've come up with what I see as 6 core elements of techno-nationalism. And those are playing out in the global economy today, and they are creating what I refer to as the Great Reorganization. And those 6 elements are, first, the weaponization of supply chains, the use of, for example, export controls, sanctions, by governments to either restrict or even choke off the transfer of technology from party A to party B, or from their national entities to a perceived adversary. The second, which is a direct response to the first, is an increase in de-risking of global supply chains and decoupling of global supply chains. And that brings on the third element, which is about reshoring, reversing offshoring in strategic industries and focusing on reshoring, ring fencing of strategic industries, and now a term that has emerged, friendshoring, right? Reorganizing global value chains around a configuration of like-minded nations that share the same strategic values. Next comes innovation mercantilism, or government-inspired or government-promoted innovation and development of leading-edge products, the use of industrial policy, a shift towards very aggressive public-private partnerships, and strategic alliances. Next comes techno-diplomacy, and that's where governments look to strike up alliances with other countries that share their same values, that share their same objectives. And finally, the final element of techno-nationalism is, in fact, a sort of a broad blanket kind of phenomenon, and that is that it's the phenomenon of a hybrid Cold War. In other words, we are in Cold War-like scenario between the great powers, the United States and China, but at the same time, those same 2 powers have engaged in very, very deep trading ties. They have very, very integrated supply chains, and this has happened over the course of decades. And therefore, we're in a paradox as well. So techno-nationalism is the result of a major paradigm shift in the global economy, particularly amongst the G7 countries, or the West, if you want to use that term. It's a West plus plus. But that also has produced an historic paradox.
Thank you, Alex. And building on that, there's a stat I'd like to share. So looking at the US SEC corporate filings, geopolitical factors were mentioned about 27% in 2015. But last year, the number went up to about 75%. Now, turning to you, Ziad, how do businesses keep track of what's happening, and where do they get these insights from?
Well, thanks very much. Firstly, congratulations, Alex, on your book. I know it's been a long time coming. And Josh, thank you for the invitation. This is a tough act to be speaking on a Friday afternoon, standing between you all and probably good amounts of coffee. But on a serious note, I think zooming out, and before I answer your question, what companies are doing, I think the theme from what I picked up, Alex, from your remarks is this: the world that we live in remains deeply connected and yet increasingly contested. I think the connectivity point is very, very important to remember and not let go of. I mean, we're in a region today that trades, about 60% of trade in this region is occurring within Asia. This is a highly connected region, and it is only second to the EU in terms of the level of regional integration that is only growing and growing. So that is a very important storyline for those of you who are in business and financial services, in the business of flows, to know that that is there and that this is not the death of globalization, but perhaps a change in its form. At the same time, I think reflecting your SEC statistic, we are in a much more contested world, and I think it's worth just speaking to the levels and layers of that companies need to be thinking about. I mean, of course, at the surface level, if you open up the newspaper today, there are the stories about the three big, what I call gray rhinos, the known risks crashing around the world stage, causing great disruption. One is US-China strategic competition. Second is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption emanating from that. And the third is the tragic conflict in the Middle East and its various ramifications. So that's up here. If you go to the next level of what is causing this contestation, it's actually things that are happening within the four corners of countries. This was the year of elections. A lot of ink has been spilt on multiple elections and their outcomes, most notably now the United States' presidential elections. In some instances, governments post those elections are well underway. In some instances, they've been quickly reversed, like Bangladesh. And in some instances, like the United States, it's too early to tell what will come on policy and personnel. But the point is that the policy and the regulatory tools, as Alex mentioned, that these governments will use, and use more tools of quote-unquote lawfare, like export controls and regulations, are going to shape the business environment and add to the heat. So that's a second level around what's happening at the country level. I think the third level that I keep my eye on is what's happening kind of bottom up. If you look around the world and you think about critical minerals, these are increasingly in places that are quite complicated and messy. The petrostates of yesterday and the electrostates of tomorrow, they take you to places like the Congo and PNG and Indonesia and so on. And in that regard, it's worth noting that today we have more civil wars underway than in the last 30 years that are lasting longer and of a greater intensity and put businesses at very short, sharp risks. Case in point, the world's longest running civil war today happens to be right here in Asia and happens to be right here in ASEAN and happens to be in Myanmar. So a year before people had to exit Russia, they were exiting Myanmar for those companies that made the decision. So the shocks. And then the last point I'll just add to kind of maybe give some more texture to Alex's point about the contested nature is that much of the rule, the operating model, the software of the current global order, this was all written post-1945 when there were about 50 states in the world total. Today there are about 200 states, and many of those states are wondering, wait a second, how can the rules that were made by 50 states, approximately, 70, 80 years ago be relevant for today and fit for purpose? That is the tectonic shift of multipolarity, where more countries are exerting agency, trying to create influence for themselves, and that makes for a messy world. So I think the bottom line is when you think of companies making these statements that geopolitical risk is more important, they're holding two thoughts in their head. They want to be global. There is a proposition to remain so. But the level of contestation at multiple levels of the global order is growing, and it is posing a fundamental question for global companies, which is, can we remain global? And if so, how do we do so?
Absolutely. And Ziad mentioned a great point about elections this year. Half the world's GDP and population have voted, and we are in a new geopolitical order. But coming to you, Alex, building on what you've both mentioned in your opening remarks, you've spoken a lot about the risks that companies and technologies face because of the new geopolitical order. But there might be some opportunities as well. So maybe starting with you, Alex.
Yeah, so let me pick up on Ziad's point about connectivity. I think it's very important to understand that the world is not deglobalizing. The geopolitical aspects that we've been discussing, techno-nationalism, those are, in essence, bifurcating the world, and specifically around strategic value chains. And there are really 12 core strategic areas. Of course, semiconductors, all the different variances of artificial intelligence, right? Supercomputing, machine learning, data science, algorithms, those types of things, quantum, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, hypersonics, aerospace, those types of things. That is a much different story than maybe the second tier, or sort of the middle gray area of global supply chains, which is full of thousands of dual-use items. These are commercial items that have military uses, could be used for military uses, but continue to be traded openly in the commercial market, right? So for now, that middle space, that gray zone, seems to be moving along, but as geopolitical confrontations continue, as escalations arise in Ukraine or whatever, that gray area will shrink, right? So a lot of that will end up, or could end up, on export control lists. But the opportunities around a world of restructuring and reorganizing value chains are in fact vast, right? You have virtually, any industry that is going to be involved in the planning, in the moving, in the building, in the talent development, all of these areas are in demand and will continue to be in demand, right? The financial side of things, the risk management side of things, the professional services firm side of things. All of these things are essential to a transformative world, or a reorganizing world, or I would say a bifurcating world in those specific technology stacks.
And coming to you, Ziad, maybe you can add something on Alex's point, but also, given there's so much happening, we've established there's so much movement and activity, how does a global business keep oversight of what's happening and plan for the future? And of course, at McKinsey, advise so many global businesses. Maybe you can share with the audience, how do you do that?
Look, I think when it comes to geopolitics, it's such an elastic term that when I talk to many CEOs, they will say, look, we understand the problem, but we don't have a lot of great solutions. Like, what do we actually do about this? How do we organize around this topic? And I think increasingly, as I've spent time with boards and CEOs around the world, I do see this emerging discipline of how do you build geopolitical resilience, a bit of a methodology. And that tends to be around investing in three different domains. One is around insight. What are your sources of insight on geopolitics in a structured way? The other is oversight. How do you actually adapt your business model to both manage down the risk and find opportunity? And then the third is this idea of foresight, looking around the corner. So let me just speak very briefly to each of those, noting we only have a few minutes here. I think on the insight point, we are moving from a world where people pick up The Economist or have a conversation with an ex-official, and it's an impressionistic painting discussion about geopolitics, to needing to have a very solid baseline of the facts. And for that, companies are making investments in a few things. Some are setting up what you can call a geopolitical risk unit. Many banks have done this. That is meant to be that eye in the sky that helps the organization understand what are the key regulatory watch points, what are the key political, key market, key data, key people security ones, and have that picture. The banks, in some instances, have also established a role for a vice chairman, who is someone with a public policy background and credentials who can negotiate and engage with a lot of the key stakeholders, setting up advisory councils of people with mixed backgrounds of media and business, and folks like Alex with a very distinguished academic and point of view as well. Those kinds of composite input. So the point here is one big source of investment is very basic in some ways, and that is, where are we getting our information, and do we feel like it is giving us, in a highly polarized news environment, a clear fact base for people from many different parts of the world to be able to say, yes, we can at least agree that these are the trends to watch. So that's the point of insights. Oversight means, I think, the idea of being global has fundamentally changed, and companies are having to think about how do we change our business model on a few different dimensions: our technology stacks, our capital structures, our legal entities, the way in which we move people, the way in which we do R&D. So there are choices that companies are having to make, and you can see them tweaking this. So you will see many companies now saying, in particularly geopolitically sensitive markets, we're just going to have a completely separate tech stack. Or we will have some nodal connectivity to the global tech stack, but limited, or we're going to remain global because we're going to prize efficiency and one firm models over anything else. Similarly, with your legal entities, you either spin off and you allow that local entity to accelerate with brand and R&D with arm's length distance, or you maintain a global franchise and model because you're going to be called into question for the risk judgment that that local entity is making. So by oversight, I'm referring to the fact that tweaking your business model to both manage risks and allow yourself to surge. And then the last point I would just say is foresight. You know, as I mentioned, exactly a year to the month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that led many companies to have to exit Russia, Myanmar happened, and many companies in this region had to do a similar move. And so the way that at least I think about it is that companies in their foresight need to think about three categories. They're the black swan things that could happen. These are unknown risks of high impact, and they're an exercise in imagination, but not too far in imagination. For example, a pandemic, there's no manual saying it's a once-a-century outcome, right? You could easily come back, and how do you deal with that from a supply chain point of view? So what are the black swans you think about from a foresight point of view? What are the gray rhinos? And we've talked about those. Those are the known risks of high impact. You see them, they're charging. You don't know when they'll hit or how hard or the impact. So again, US, China is a core one in this region. But to your point, the silver linings, the opportunities, a few of the ones that companies that I speak with are focused on are number one, industrial policy. I mean, the flip side of a more techno-nationalist protectionist world is that companies are dispersing vast amounts of money to build national champions in particular sectors, and that's an opportunity for a company. It's also going to be probably a fair bit of spending and inefficiency, but that's a question for policymakers, for business. They're thinking about, we see a line to spend on chips, ecosystems in multiple markets, right? Or defense spend. I think the other silver lining is new trade corridors. So some of the corridors that existed are moving. Just as an example, Prime Minister Modi was here in Singapore. One of the key MOUs that he signed in Singapore was on scaling up a partnership on a semis ecosystem. Singapore makes 10% of the world's semis manufacturing equipment. India is moving up the manufacturing value chain. So what is the opportunity set in those new trade corridors? So the point here, I think, Jas, is as you were saying, there is risk, there is opportunity, but there's a method and a discipline that companies need to build and invest in around insight, oversight, and foresight to be able to navigate these trends.
Great. Many thanks, Ziad, for that answer. And just notice the clock. We've almost come to the end. I'll have last closing remarks from both, maybe starting with you, Alex, and then to you, Ziad. What are some of the books, tools, and any other thoughts that you can share with the audience that can help them stay up to date with what's happening in geopolitics? Of course, your book, but anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah,
sorry.
So any source or resource that you can access that enables you to scenario map, right? As part of insights and oversights that Ziad mentioned, the way that visualizes, the way that materializes, that's part of a really vigorous scenario mapping process. And so whether you're using AI, whether you're using people, whether you're using third parties, the scenario mapping process, I think, is critical.
3 books. Number 1, Alex's. Please do read it. Number 2, I think if you're interested in this broader theme of the discipline of managing political risk, the former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice actually wrote an excellent book with some really good case studies and frameworks. So that's called Managing Political Risk. I think the last point I'd make, and maybe this is probably a little bit counterintuitive for a technology and fintech audience, is that even as we talk about technology and data, the world still runs on concrete things. And as in that regard, I'd highly recommend a book by Ed Conway called Material World. And Material World talks about 6 basic elements that are critical to the functioning of the global economy. One of which is, for example, obviously cobalt and oil and steel, but one of which, quite interestingly, is sand, which goes into glass, which goes into fiber optic cables. And so I think not losing sight of the fact that even as we think about the internet and the Ethernet and software, that there are these fundamental foundational concrete elements around which there is a scramble for resources and critical minerals that drive all of this. And so keeping an eye on those, and those might well be things you have to think about from a supply chain point of view as well in your own business lines.
Thank you, Alex. Ziad, please join me in thanking both of them for the insights. That's all the time we had. And for more insights, join a class by Alex or contact Ziad for advisory services.